All right, well, thank you, everybody, for having me here and giving me a chance to share some thoughts with you about public transportation in connection with COP26 and the overall mission of the transportation sector to do its part to address climate change through decarbonization. The COP26 Declaration basically recognized the importance of mode shift. But I think it's fair to say that many people in the public transportation advocacy community globally were somewhat disappointed in the nature of the declaration and the focus that COP26 placed generally on transport decarbonization. In a way, is very much like my home state of Massachusetts, which is to say that the driving, and no pun intended, the driving conversation about transport sector decarbonization is focused on electrifying the light duty fleet, right? The passenger vehicle, the trucks, that's the main focus. And therefore, mode shift to more sustainable modes like transit, cycling, and walking at the local level, at the state level, and even at the global level, sometimes I think get short shrift. Now, the C40 cities in Glasgow put out a statement basically saying that in their view, public transport usage has to double in global cities over the next decade. That's a heavy lift. That's a heavy lift, and it's a heavy lift under normal circumstances in the context of emerging from a catastrophic pandemic, this enormous generational pattern break that is affecting all of us. It's an even heavier lift. It doesn't mean it's impossible. And I'm going to offer a framework for thinking about how we might achieve at least some measure of the C40 initiative. Now, the data is moving in the wrong direction. If you look at this is United States data, but if you see here, as we're quote unquote recovering, it doesn't seem to many people like we're recovering from anything. I understand that with the Omicron variant. But it seems like we are emerging into a new era, transitioning from pandemic to endemic. And as that's happening, you can see emissions rising on the transportation sector in the United States. And you can see a 10% rise here on a year-to-year basis on the transportation side. So the data is not moving in the right direction. Gasoline usage is about level. Diesel, which is basically has something to do with how we move goods and services around the United States, is actually on the increase. So we know that this is happening in real time, and so we know that has been a stabilization and, in fact, maybe even a shift toward more auto mobility as a result of the pandemic. At the same time, we're trying to focus on reducing carbon emissions. So when you think about decarbonizing the transportation sector, I would argue moving to electric, certainly the biggest bang for the buck. No question about it when it comes to carbon emissions, but it's the path of least resistance, right? And it's only the biggest bang for the buck if you ignore the well-to-wheel impacts of carbon on making and owning and running an electric vehicle. And the focus on electric vehicle, we all have to recognize, is a focus on carbon, but it ignores every other negative externality of automobility, including the issue of particulate matter emissions, which do not go away when the fleet is 100% electric. So the limitations of transportation sector decarbonization, for those of us who care about shifting people to public transport, it's important to keep in mind, decarbonization alone doesn't address and actually may exacerbate many mobility negative externalities, and including those that denigrate public health. There have been several studies over the course of the pandemic. I think the most notable one coming from Harvard's Chan School of Public Health, that study showed a 15% higher COVID mortality rate among people living in communities who had long-term exposure to PM 2.5, right? There's a clear public health link between the emissions that come from brake friction and auto tire friction and some tailpipe to public health. That does not go away if we're all driving electric vehicles. I would argue that a plan that relies too heavily on EVs doesn't address and may exacerbate the tragedy of the concrete commons, right? We have to recognize that road and highway capacity will still remain relatively finite in most parts of the world. It's an issue that needs to be considered and addressed as we plan out the future. And therefore, that a plan that's too heavily reliant on EVs will probably contribute to continuation of poor land use choices and transportation injustice and spatial disparities, income-based disparities. In the United States, the coming of the interstate highway system in the middle of the last century was a spatial dislocation that caused a segregation and a separation of people according to income and race. It didn't do that deliberately, but it did that in fact. If we are now on the brink because of the pandemic of thinking about EVs as a solution and about work from home as a solution, using technology to make people quote unquote more convenient and safer, we're about to make the same mistakes all over again. Finally, a plan that relies, I think, too heavily on EVs fails to address all of these other carbon emission consequences to more automobility, which I think you all know about, right? Everything that's associated with keeping a car on the road, even if it's 100% battery electric, is producing carbon emissions, whether it's road production, parking lot production, construction and maintenance. We haven't been able to square that circle. So COP26 that focuses so heavily on fleet electrification and gives relatively short shrift to mode shift is troublesome because there's a time value to the reduction of carbon emissions, right? Carbon emissions are cumulative. And so mode shift can be a very important short-term measure as in the effort to reduce carbon and also, by the way, improve particularly urban environments as we're recovering from the pandemic, right? The other thing about EVs and electrification is that it has the potential to exacerbate already existing inequalities. And I want to put a thought in everyone's head that when you hear people talk about decarbonization and electric vehicles, that you ask about decarbonization equity. And what do I mean by decarbonization equity? A plan too heavily reliant on EVs will likely require significant public subsidies to succeed. In the United States, that's the standard, that we believe we have to give substantial public subsidy to encourage people to adopt EVs. That subsidy also includes charging subsidy. Who gets those subsidies? What does subsidy equity mean and how can we achieve it? The answer to who gets those subsidies, at least in the United States, particularly in the earlier years, will be people who are whiter and wealthier. And I think that will probably be true across the board. Should we also think about charging equity and how would you define charging equity, right? I would propose that you consider charging equity as including equitable distribution. Is it available near or where I live? Equitable availability. Is it available without a premium cost? And affordability. Now, the pandemic has had terrifically negative effects on public transport. I didn't even bother to put a slide in showing the ridership drop because I'm sure we've all seen those a million times over. So we know ridership took a steep plunge because in March and April of 2020 as a result of the pandemic. But I would think I want to point out a few things here that I think are really important for people to address. One is that agencies generally rely rather heavily on fare box revenue for operating expenses. This has caused a financial crisis. The reason why in the United States, the Congress had to provide operating subsidies in 3 different federal COVID aid bills is because agencies generally rely on fares for about 33% on average of their operating budgets. Some are higher. New York is higher. Some are lower. Atlanta is lower. In Boston, where I'm from, it's about 33%. Reductions in ridership as a result of a combination of what I would call pandemic fear and shifts in employment, what's called the Great Resignation or work from home, have had a major effect on ridership. Now, the first, if you think about it, the fear, that's an attitudinal and behavior issue, right? Based on how people perceive their risk in connection with the pandemic. The second is structural, and neither one is in the direct or completely within the control of any transit agency. That's really problematic. The structural changes in ridership, which is primarily different working patterns, either working from home or working more flexibly, are going to require a new approach to service delivery, to transit service delivery, offering more frequencies all day long rather than simply responding to the pre-pandemic morning and evening peak paradigm, right? Having more frequency all day long to respond to a new way of living and a new way of working will require more funding for operators and for equipment. Operator shortage is a serious national issue in the United States, particularly on the bus side. Wages, benefits, really, I say bad collective bargaining systems that cater to older employees and fail to attract newcomers, all need to be addressed if we're going to hit COP26 targets of doubling transit ridership over the next decade, right? And we have to keep in mind that transit agencies have additional operating costs now that they didn't have for COVID, including stepped up cleaning and hygiene, right? So all these factors from the pandemic are influencing how agencies will survive. I don't believe that the agencies can continue to rely heavily on fare revenue if they're going to survive and thrive, which means they need substitute sources of stable revenue going forward. Where we're living today is in a point of time that I'm calling the Great Convergence. The convergence of our desire to fulfill the need for transport sector decarbonization and pandemic effects, right? These things are coming together and colliding in real time. How we navigate them both in a way that is collaborative, in a way that understands the connections between the two and tries to rebuild from this, I think will determine not just whether we are able to meet carbon targets, but whether we're able to rebuild our cities back from the pandemic. I'd like to point out, as a result of this great convergence, a bunch of things are happening in real time. I mentioned that the time and scale of ridership recovery on transit is uncertain, and fare revenue will be diminished and unstable. At the same time this is happening in real time, if we're moving to electric vehicles, the gas tax, which many systems depend on and have throughout a century and a half, will continue to reduce and go to zero. And any transportation climate initiative fee, any carbon emissions fee will go to zero, right? There are no plans that I'm aware of anywhere in the United States to replace that lost revenue. In my home state of Massachusetts, that's almost $1 billion of revenue annually. At the same time we're dealing with that, we have a ridership and fare revenue crisis on the transit side. Those are the things that are converging in real time, and I don't think that we should look at them in isolation. So I'd like to offer 5 steps to meeting the spirit of COP26 from a public transport perspective. Step 1, I would say transit agencies need to prioritize the transition from diesel to electric, particularly on the rail side. In the United States, too many agencies continue to rely on diesel locomotives as the main power source for intercity rail and commuter rail. Public agencies need to lead. If we're going to ask people to adopt the new energy vehicles, electric vehicles, the public side needs to lead. And so that has to be a priority. Second, agencies need to rely less on fares, and governments need to find more stable revenue sources for operating expenses. In the United States, I believe the federal government should do what it did in the 1970s and contribute a share of transit operating costs. Transit agencies need to restructure service delivery to meet post-pandemic demand, and I think that means more frequencies all day long. Fourth point is that agencies and municipalities should collaborate on networked mobility hubs, places that act as connectors for transit and sustainable mobility, providing legible places for microtransit solutions to short urban trips and first and last mile solutions. And then finally, the externalities of even electric automobility ought to be priced. Parking needs to be priced, particulate matter emission charges need to be considered, road use pricing. That's not just a moral issue about carbon. That's a nuts and bolts, bread and butter revenue issue, because something needs to replace the gas tax. What will that be? We can figure out the answer to that in a way that might also encourage a shift towards sustainability. And I'll leave you with the framework for consideration as we're all sort of grappling with COP26, with the desire to decarbonize and the urgent need to rebuild from the pandemic. And this framework basically proposes that we adopt and be aligned with some guiding principles when it comes to public transportation and think about specific policies and interventions. The guiding principles I put out for consideration, this is one person's view, that public transit is essential for social cohesion, that without it, with the future of technology-based work from home and isolation, social cohesion begins to collapse and fray. And we all know globally and in the United States, the last thing we should be doing in this moment in time is fail to pay attention to the already fraying social cohesion. A second guiding principle needs to be public health. Raise the issue of particulate matter to a level that's close to carbon. It's a different issue, but it's a public health issue of great importance. And by the way, walking, cycling, all of these things play into a better public health future. Think of the small business economy in the urban setting and how public transportation can support it, particularly coming out of the pandemic. Think about building urban density without crowding and how that would work. Reimagining the urban public realm and the urban streetscape to allow more bus dedicated lanes, more BRT, more safe cycling lanes, more 15, 20-minute walking neighborhoods that allow people and businesses to thrive again. And then think about equity, and I reference my concerns, particularly about decarbonization equity. The specific policies and interventions that one might use to fulfill those guiding principles would be recovery corridors and mobility hubs, frequent all-day transit and rail service, a commitment to transit connectivity and innovation, a public transport system powered by electricity, reducing high automobility subsidies, and that means charging for roads, charging for parking, and a commitment to decarbonization equity. I want to end with one quick note. A public transportation powered by electricity is essential. Fleet electrification is very expensive, not just for equipment. For buses, you need new storage facilities and new charging facilities. For rail, you may need to install new catenary systems. Institutionally, managers of rail systems are risk averse to try new approaches. Maintenance crews are often neither equipped nor trained to handle these new electric vehicle types. It's exciting. When we talk about fleet electrification, we have to understand how challenging that actually is on the ground to transit agencies generally to do. Those are my thoughts. I hope that some of them may have sparked some thoughts on your part. I thank you for your time and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.